Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from Econosite, and in this video, let's talk about the troubles the Chinese economy is facing in 8 graphics. The country's economy is at a turning point right now. China relied heavily for decades on investment in the infrastructure and real estate. That model of growth is now crumbling. If you look at the composition of the Chinese economy, GFCF or asset creation makes up almost 42% of the Chinese GDP, quite a bit more than the global average. Real estate is part of that. Real estate makes up roughly 1/4 of the entire Chinese GDP. So the first problem is that the real estate sector is no longer the growth engine that it has been for decades. The lengthy boom in the Chinese real estate came to a halt in 2020 when the government, fearful of ballooning debt, introduced policies that curtailed property developers' access to credit. Add to that the pandemic era, zero COVID restrictions on daily lives and the economy. The result was a steep drop in both home sales and new construction as well as investment. Activity in this key sector is almost cut in half from its peak. After GFCF, the next major contributor to the Chinese economy is the Chinese consumer. Final consumption expenditure makes up about 38% of the GDP here. That means the real estate sector and consumption put together makes up more than 60% of the Chinese GDP. And both the sectors are struggling. The real estate slump has deepened a sense of gloom among Chinese consumers. Their optimism about the future of the economy collapsed during the pandemic and hasn't recovered since. In the past, consumers borrowed heavily to finance home purchases and were hoping for bumper gains in these asset prices. But now that the property prices have in fact been falling, they are responding by cutting back on spending. A consequence of weak consumption and private sector investment in China is deflation, which is in stark contrast to inflation that has been troubling much of the world for the past few years. Almost since the June of 2023, the consumer prices in China have been falling, a sign of a severe weakness in the demand. Falling home sales are dragging down the prices for home appliances, furniture, and home improvement goods. Deflation weighs heavily on household incomes, corporate earnings, and government taxes because they all go down. It is a downward spiral that can be difficult to get out of. Deflation will reduce the nominal GDP, thus raising the debt to GDP ratio and worsening the debt overhang. That brings us to the debt problem of China. China's overall debts have ballooned to the equivalent of more than 300% of its GDP, far more than that of the United States as a share of the GDP. A large chunk of China's debt is owed by its local governments. These local governments may find it difficult to repay the debts. Their finances are under growing pressure now that the revenue from selling land to property developers, a key source of income for them, has dried up. Real estate firms themselves are in trouble. They also account for another sizable chunk of China's debt. Then Chinese banks have exposure to both these indebted sectors, meaning banks have lent money to both the local governments and the real estate firms. So the banks can expect the loan losses to mount, therefore reducing the supply of credit to the rest of the economy, putting further pressure on growth. Then there is the structural problem of the falling population. While China's workforce is still large, the boost to the supply of workers from rapid urbanization is mostly played out. People are having fewer babies, overall population is shrinking and skewing older. That is, the pool of workers and consumers in China is set to get smaller, which will make sustaining the future economic growth that much more difficult. The next two problems arise out of the aggressive posture that China has taken towards the world. Foreign investors are exiting China. After a lengthy streak of foreign capital moving into China, stock and bond investors began pulling money out of China in the first quarter of 2022, and foreign direct investment into factories, offices, and businesses reversed in the third quarter of 2023. China, seeking new avenues for growth, is pouring money into factories and new industries, especially green technology. Demand at home is weak. So this state-led investment is going to create a growing glut of products that China will seek buyers for overseas. We can see the signs of that where China has overtaken Japan as the world's largest exporter of passenger cars, and Chinese companies such as BYD are seeking to dominate the growing global market for greener forms of transport. This Chinese effort is being met by stiff resistance, especially in the United States and other advanced economies, where the governments are tightening restrictions on Chinese imports. Both anti-dumping measures and import tariffs affecting China are on their way up. It is difficult to see where the growth is going to come from for China. In the past, China was able to respond to economic setbacks with stimulus spending on infrastructure. But these days, China's need for roads, railways and airports has largely been met. Where would the state spend? And even if they find some place to release stimulus spending, they will hit the debt wall. With its economic challenges multiplying and options for stimulus limited, the country looks set for much slower growth rates in the years ahead. In summary, real estate and consumption are major contributors to the Chinese economy. Both sectors are struggling to say the least. China's high debt pile is partly responsible for this slump. Chinese exports add to their GDP, unlike in many other nations that import more than they export. But upcoming stiff trade barriers against China will hit their exports as well. Combine all this with the demographic issue that China is facing, and we can conclude that China is unlikely to see the explosive growth rates that it has enjoyed for decades. I hope you found this analysis interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.